All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a device that literally changed the world, the Apple iPod. We're going to trace its whole wild journey, from a super chaotic beginning to its incredibly quiet end. It's a massive story about innovation, some fierce internal battles, and, well, how technology just inevitably evolves over time.
But right off the bat, you've got to ask yourself, why on earth would Apple purposefully kill off the very gadget that revolutionized their entire company? To really understand why this absolute legend of a device was finally put to rest in 2022, we have to look at how its biggest wins actually planted the seeds for its own downfall. It is just a brilliant case study in business strategy and product life cycles.
So, to set the stage, let's look at the pre-iPod music era. Let's rewind the clock all the way back to 2001. If you were around, you probably remember this, but if not, just try to picture the massive headache Apple was trying to solve. You basically had two terrible options for portable music. You either lugged around a bulky CD player that skipped every single time you took a step, or you used early MP3 players. And man, those things were incredibly frustrating, clunky bricks that just weren't fun to use. Meanwhile, Napster was completely revolutionizing how we access music on our computers. But getting those digital songs off the desktop and into your pocket? Absolute nightmare.
Enter Tony Fadell. People often call him the father of the iPod. He was a former Philips engineer, and he had this incredibly clear vision for a sleek, pocket-sized device that could actually hold thousands of songs. Fadell had originally started his own company to build this, aiming to be the Dell of consumer electronics, but they just couldn't get a second round of funding. So when a startup failed, he took this grand vision and ended up pitching it straight to Steve Jobs.
Which brings us to the actual birth of the iPod. Jobs totally warmed to the idea, and Apple kicked off a top-secret project codenamed Dulcimer. But behind closed doors, the development process was an absolute battlefield. On one side, you had John Rubinstein leading the team, pushing really hard for a larger 10-gigabyte drive and traditional physical buttons. But on the exact opposite side was Steve Jobs and his legendary perfectionism. Jobs insisted on capping the storage at just 5 gigs to keep the design incredibly sleek, and he fiercely advocated for this revolutionary idea of a click wheel over standard buttons. As you might guess, Jobs' vision won out. In October 2001, the very first iPod dropped. It was this white, minimalist marvel. It held 1,000 songs, promised a 10-hour battery life, and featured that iconic click wheel that felt exactly like tuning a vintage radio. There was literally nothing else like it on the market. And the market's reaction? Absolutely massive. In just the first 6 months, Apple sold an astounding 400,000 units. To put that into perspective, the original iPod had some huge limitations. It came with a super heavy premium price tag, and initially it only worked if you owned a Mac computer. But the design, the simplicity, and that seamless user experience resonated so deeply with music lovers that they just bought it in droves anyway. So how did they capitalize on that? Let's look at how they expanded the ecosystem.
Apple knew they had a monster hit on their hands, but to really dominate the market and crush rivals like the Microsoft Zune, they needed to evolve, and fast. They took 3 highly strategic steps. First, in 2002, they finally made the iPod compatible with Windows. That instantly opened the floodgates to the massive global PC market. Second, they launched the iTunes Store in 2003, which was a total game changer. It let people legally and easily buy individual songs for the first time. And third, they formed strategic partnerships, like teaming up with Nike for fitness gear. Those 3 moves turned the iPod from a niche Mac accessory into an absolute global cultural phenomenon.
They didn't stop at software either. They rapidly expanded the hardware family. By fragmenting the product line, they brilliantly captured every single demographic. Think about it. You had the iPod mini in 2004 for folks on a budget. Then the tiny, screenless iPod Shuffle in 2005, perfect for hitting the gym. That same year brought the super sleek Nano. And then, bam, 2007, the iPod Touch arrives, bringing a multi-touch screen, Wi-Fi, and apps to the lineup. Apple successfully created an iPod for every lifestyle and every single wallet.
But right here is where things take a turn, ultimately creating its own demise. Right at the absolute peak of the iPod's power, Apple completely blurred the lines of consumer tech. In 2007, you have the release of the iPod Touch, bringing a brilliant touchscreen, internet, and apps to the dedicated music player. But, released that exact same year, the very first iPhone? This thing was revolutionary. It combined a mobile phone, an internet browser, and, here's the kicker, a media player all into one device. By launching both simultaneously, Apple basically put a ticking clock on the standalone MP3 player.
And things shifted incredibly fast. The rise of all-in-one smartphones meant you just didn't need to carry two devices in your pocket anymore. Plus, you had this massive shift toward on-demand streaming services like Spotify, which totally eliminated the need to manually sync purchased tracks or CD rips via iTunes. As smartphones absorbed all those massive streaming capabilities, the standalone iPod simply began losing its primary purpose.
Which brings us to the inevitable end of an era.
With the writing on the wall and sales steadily declining, Apple had to make the totally logical, if a bit emotional, decision to wind down this legendary product line. And they pulled the plug slowly, in phases. They started by discontinuing the original Clickwheel Classic model in 2009. Years later, in 2017, they cut the screenless Shuffle and the Nano. They actually gave the iPod Touch one final hardware update in 2019 with its 7th generation model. But finally, in May 2022, the iPod Touch was officially discontinued and the brand was formally retired.
So why 2022? Why kill off that last 7th generation Touch then? Honestly, keeping it alive just didn't make mathematical sense for consumers anymore. The Touch was stuck running an outdated A10 processor from way back in 2016 and had a tiny 4-inch screen. Now compare it to the alternatives. For just $99, you could grab a HomePod Mini for home listening. For $329, you could get a 9th gen iPad with a massive screen. Or for about $100 more than the iPod, you could pick up an iPhone SE, giving you cellular, a vastly better camera, and a modern chip.
At a starting price of $199, that final iPod Touch was a seriously tough sell. It couldn't handle heavy mobile games, and the screen was way too small for modern video consumption. Really, it only appealed to hardcore collectors or parents looking for a cheap, non-cellular starter device for their little kids.
Which brings us to the ultimate truth of this whole explainer. Why do you need an iPod when it's already contained right there inside your iPhone? The iPod didn't fail. It wasn't crushed by a competitor. It was literally so successful that its entire core functionality was just seamlessly absorbed into the smartphone we already carry with us every single minute of the day.
Its greatest legacy is reminding us of the sheer power of design, simplicity, and a relentless focus on the user experience. The source material puts it beautifully. The iPod may be gone, but its melody lingers, reminding us that even in a digital age, music can be an experience, a memory, and a symphony carried in your pocket. So, as we close the book on this incredible gadget, I want to leave you with this to chew on. What modern device in your pocket right now is quietly laying the groundwork for its own eventual replacement? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer today, and I'll catch you in the next one.